Captain Marcus Sterling had negotiated peace treaties with hostile species across 12 star systems, but nothing in his diplomatic experience had prepared him for the crystalline magnificence of Queen Saralyn's throne room or the way her presence seemed to diminish everything else in the vast chamber to insignificance. The Zephyrian Queen sat upon a throne carved from living crystal that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns reflecting her emotional state, her ethereal beauty enhanced by the kind of absolute authority that came from ruling an empire spanning multiple galaxies. She was tall even by Zephyrian standards, her alabaster skin marked with the silvery patterns that indicated royal bloodline, while her eyes held the accumulated wisdom and ruthlessness of someone who had never lost a strategic engagement in over 3 centuries of rule. Captain Sterling, Queen Saralyn's voice carried harmonics that made the crystal walls resonate with royal authority. The Human Colonial Alliance seeks expanded trade agreements and mutual defense protocols with the Zephyrian Empire. Marcus stepped forward with the practiced precision of someone whose military career had taught him to project confidence even when facing overwhelming odds. Your Majesty, humanity offers partnership based on mutual respect and shared strategic interests. Our combined capabilities could accomplish what, exactly? The Queen interrupted, her tone carrying the dismissive courtesy of someone whose patience for inferior proposals was limited. Captain, your species has existed for mere millennia while my empire has endured for eons. What could humanity possibly offer that we require? The question stung because Marcus had spent months preparing comprehensive proposals that highlighted humanity's technological innovations, strategic flexibility, and proven ability to adapt to challenges that had destroyed older civilizations. But Queen Saralyn's dismissal suggested she'd barely reviewed the materials his advanced team had provided. Your Majesty, Marcus replied, drawing on years of diplomatic training to maintain professional composure despite growing frustration. Humanity's rapid technological development and adaptive strategic thinking have proven effective in conflicts where traditional approaches failed. Our recent campaigns against the Void Syndicate demonstrated that humans can learn from their betters, Queen Saralyn said, her crystalline throne flaring with patterns that indicated controlled impatience. Captain Sterling, your reputation precedes you. The miracle of Kepler Station, the impossible victory at Titan's Gate. Impressive achievements for someone from such a young species. Marcus felt a moment of hope that the Queen's knowledge of his career indicated genuine interest in collaboration, but her next words shattered that optimism entirely. However, Queen Saralyn continued, rising from her throne with fluid grace that made her seem to float rather than walk. Ultimately, you're just a man from a young species offering treaties my empire doesn't need. The dismissal hit Marcus harder than enemy weapons fire, partly because of its personal nature but mostly because he genuinely hoped to work with someone whose tactical brilliance he'd studied and admired for years. Queen Saralyn's strategic innovations had revolutionized galactic warfare, her diplomatic achievements had brought peace to sectors that had been at war for millennia, and her leadership had transformed the Zephyrian Empire into the most stable civilization in known space. To be dismissed as, just a man, by someone he considered possibly the finest military mind in the galaxy felt like having his lifetime of achievement reduced to insignificance. Your Majesty, Marcus said, struggling to maintain diplomatic protocol while processing what felt like personal rejection, perhaps if we could schedule private discussions to review humanity's specific proposals. Captain Sterling, Queen Saralyn said, her voice carrying finality that ended all negotiation, the Zephyrian Empire will consider limited trade agreements through appropriate diplomatic channels. Your presence at these proceedings is acknowledged. The phrase, acknowledged, carried the political weight of polite dismissal, making it clear that Marcus's role in further negotiations would be minimal at best. But something in Queen Saralyn's delivery, the way she avoided eye contact while speaking, the slight tension in her voice, suggested that her dismissal carried emotional cost she was trying to hide. As the formal ceremony concluded and various diplomatic representatives began filing out of the throne room, Marcus found himself studying Queen Saralyn's behavior with the analytical attention he usually reserved for enemy tactical patterns. Her dismissal had been personal enough to suggest familiarity with his career that went beyond casual briefings, and her obvious discomfort while delivering it implied that reducing him to just a man might not reflect her genuine opinion. Captain Sterling, came a voice beside him as Ambassador Chen approached with the careful expression of someone whose political career had been damaged by the negotiations' failure. Perhaps we should return to the embassy and develop alternative approaches to Zephyrian relations. Perhaps, Marcus replied, but his attention remained focused on Queen Saralyn, who was now speaking with other diplomatic representatives with the kind of gracious authority that had been notably absent from her interaction with him. Watching her command the room with effortless political skill, Marcus began to wonder whether Queen Saralyn's hostile reception had been strategic choice rather than genuine disdain. Her dismissal had been too specific, too personal, and too uncomfortable for someone who was supposedly indifferent to his presence. Ambassador, Marcus said, making a decision that his diplomatic training suggested was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, I think I'll remain for the reception this evening. There may be opportunities for informal discussion that formal protocols don't allow. Ambassador Chen's expression suggested he thought Marcus was making a mistake that could compromise. The diplomatic reception that evening transformed the palace's crystal gardens into a constellation of bioluminescent beauty where representatives from dozens of species mingled under Zephyria's twin moons, but Marcus found himself observing only one person among the assembled dignitaries, Queen Saralyn, whose commanding presence seemed to bend conversations and social dynamics around her like gravity affecting nearby objects. Captain Sterling, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the delegation's xenocultural specialist, approached with 2 glasses of Zephyrian crystal wine and the expression of someone whose professional curiosity had been triggered by unusual behavior patterns. I've been watching Queen Saralyn's interactions this evening, and I'm noticing some interesting inconsistencies in her diplomatic approach. Marcus accepted the wine while keeping his attention focused on the Queen, who was currently engaged in what appeared to be a pleasant conversation with the Centauran trade representative. What kind of inconsistencies? She's been gracious, attentive, and genuinely interested in every delegation except ours, Elena observed, her anthropological training allowing her to analyze social dynamics with scientific precision. With the Andromedans, she discussed military history. With the Centaurans, economic policy. With the Vegan Council, cultural exchange programs. But whenever our delegation approaches, she shifts to formal protocol that maintains maximum social distance. Marcus had noticed the same pattern, but hearing Elena's analysis confirmed his growing suspicion that Queen Saralyn's hostile reaction to humanity wasn't based on political disinterest but on something far more personal and complex. Dar. Vasquez, Marcus said, watching as Queen Saralyn's body language shifted subtly whenever she seemed aware of his presence. How familiar would the Queen be with human military history? Specifically, with individual human career records. Given her reputation for strategic analysis, probably quite familiar, Elena replied, then paused as she followed Marcus's gaze. Captain, are you suggesting that Queen Saralyn's dismissal of you this morning was based on detailed knowledge of your achievements rather than ignorance of them? I'm suggesting that someone doesn't put that much personal venom into dismissing someone they consider insignificant, Marcus said, noting how Queen Saralyn's conversations with other representatives flowed naturally while her brief interactions with human diplomats carried visible tension. As the evening progressed, Marcus confirmed his hypothesis through careful observation. Queen Saralyn's commanding presence never wavered during her diplomatic discussions, but in the brief moments when she thought no one was watching, when she was transitioning between conversations or pausing to consider her responses, her gaze would find him across the garden with the kind of awareness that suggested he was never far from her thoughts. More tellingly, when Ambassador Chen made a particularly insightful comment about galactic trade policy during a group discussion, Queen Saralyn's immediate response was to glance toward Marcus as if seeking his reaction, before catching herself and redirecting her attention to more appropriate diplomatic targets. She's been studying you, Elena whispered as they observed Queen Saralyn gracefully extract herself from a conversation with Martian representatives and move toward the garden's more secluded areas. Her body language suggests she's hyper-aware of your location, your reactions, your level of engagement with other conversations. That's not the behavior of someone who considers you insignificant. Marcus felt his understanding of the morning's disaster shifting as he realized that Queen Saralyn's hostile reception might have been defensive reaction rather than genuine dismissal. Dr. Vasquez, from a xenocultural perspective, What would cause a leader like Queen Saralyn to treat someone she's clearly studied extensively with such obvious hostility? Elena considered the question while analyzing Queen Saralyn's movement patterns through the reception. Fear, she said finally. Not fear of threat or competition, but fear of personal interest that conflicts with political necessity. Captain, I think Queen Saralyn sees you as dangerous not because you're insignificant, but because you're significant in ways she can't afford to acknowledge. The revelation reframed everything about their morning confrontation and suggested that Queen Saralyn's dismissal had been self-protection rather than professional judgment. Marcus realized that his opportunity for genuine conversation wouldn't come through formal diplomatic channels but through finding moments when the Queen's guard was down and her personal feelings could override political calculations. His chance came when Queen Saralyn moved to a quieter section of the Crystal Gardens where bioluminescent flowers created natural privacy screens, ostensibly to review diplomatic documents but actually, Marcus suspected, to escape the constant performance demands of royal social obligations. Your Majesty, Marcus said, approaching with careful respect for both personal space and royal protocol, might I have a moment of your time for informal strategic discussion? Queen Saralyn's initial response was the same controlled hostility she'd shown during their formal encounter, but her body language suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to private conversation. Captain Sterling, I believe our positions regarding human-Zephyrian relations were made clear during this morning's proceedings. They were indeed, Your Majesty, Marcus agreed, settling into a respectful position that allowed for genuine dialogue without challenging her authority. But I'm curious about your perspective on the Void Syndicate campaigns from a strategic analysis standpoint rather than diplomatic necessity. The Queen's expression shifted subtly as she recognized his transition from formal negotiation to professional consultation. The Kepler station engagement was interesting, she admitted, her voice losing some of its hostile edge as intellectual curiosity began to override political caution. Your use of gravitational anomalies as tactical weapons demonstrated creative adaptation to environmental constraints. Your Majesty is familiar with the specific tactical details? Marcus asked, though her knowledge level was becoming increasingly obvious. I make it my business to study military innovations that could affect galactic strategic balance, Queen Saralyn replied, but her admission carried weight that suggested more than casual professional interest. The Titan's Gate victory was particularly instructive regarding human adaptability under impossible circumstances. Their conversation evolved from tactical analysis to genuine strategic consultation as Queen Saralyn revealed knowledge of his career that went far beyond what casual professional interest would explain. She had studied not just his major victories but his approach to impossible situations, his leadership methods under extreme pressure, and his innovations in multi-species military coordination. Your Majesty, Marcus said as their discussion deepened into territory that felt more like intellectual partnership than diplomatic consultation, may I ask why you've devoted such detailed attention to human military developments? Queen Saralyn's composure faltered briefly before she reasserted royal control. Strategic necessity requires comprehensive intelligence about all potential allies and adversaries. And which category do you consider humanity, Your Majesty? The question hung between them as Queen Saralyn processed implications that clearly went beyond simple strategic classification. When she spoke again, her voice carried vulnerability that her royal authority couldn't quite mask. Captain Sterling, that may be the most difficult question you could have asked. The conversation that followed Queen Saralyn's admission of uncertainty revealed depths of complexity that transformed Marcus's understanding of both her hostility and her position as an absolute monarch whose personal desires had been subjugated to political necessity for over 3 centuries. Captain Sterling, Queen Saralyn said, her voice carrying exhaustion that royal training couldn't entirely mask, do you have any conception of what it means to rule an empire where every decision affects billions of lives, where every personal feeling must be evaluated for political implications, where every relationship becomes a potential weakness that enemies can exploit? Marcus studied her face in the garden's bioluminescent lighting, seeing past royal composure to someone whose isolation made his own command responsibilities seem simple by comparison. Your Majesty, I've commanded fleets where tactical mistakes could cost thousands of lives, but I've never had to balance personal feelings against the survival of entire civilizations. Then you begin to understand, Queen Saralyn said, settling onto a crystalline bench with movements that suggested she was allowing herself a rare moment of unguarded honesty. Captain, I have followed your career not as potential enemy or ally, but as someone whose approach to impossible situations has earned my professional respect. The pause before professional respect carried weight that suggested her feelings went far beyond collegial admiration, and Marcus realized that her morning dismissal had been an attempt to maintain distance from emotions she couldn't afford to acknowledge. Your Majesty, Marcus said carefully, professional respect typically doesn't require the kind of detailed career analysis you've clearly conducted regarding my military service. Queen Saralyn's laugh carried bitter acknowledgement of truths she'd been trying to deny. Captain, you commanded multi-species alliances that should have been impossible to coordinate. You turned desperate last stands into strategic victories that reshaped galactic power structures. You demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical brilliance and adaptive leadership that I. She trailed off, clearly struggling with admissions that carried implications beyond professional admiration. That you what, Your Majesty? That I have never encountered in someone whose company I could enjoy without political complications, Queen Saralyn finished, her honesty creating intimacy that her royal authority had been designed to prevent. Marcus felt understanding crystallizing as he realized that Queen Saralyn's hostility stemmed not from disdain but from attraction she couldn't afford to pursue. Your Majesty, are you saying that your dismissal this morning was an attempt to maintain appropriate distance from someone you find personally interesting? Captain Sterling, I am saying that I have spent centuries learning to suppress personal desires that conflict with royal responsibility, Queen Saralyn replied, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated sacrifices. I cannot afford to be interested in anyone whose position creates political complications for my empire. And my position as human representative creates such complications. Your position as someone I respect, admire, and find genuinely attractive creates complications that could destabilize carefully maintained diplomatic balances throughout this sector of the galaxy, Queen Saralyn said, her admission carrying the kind of vulnerability that absolute monarchs rarely allowed themselves to display. Marcus realized that their conversation had moved far beyond diplomatic consultation into territory where personal connection and political necessity were creating impossible choices for both of them. Your Majesty, he said, what if personal connection could enhance rather than compromise political effectiveness? What if partnership between individuals could strengthen rather than weaken the alliances between peoples? Queen Saralyn's expression shifted to something that combined hope with terror as she processed the implications of what he was suggesting. Captain, that would require trusting that personal feelings could coexist with political responsibility without creating the kind of weakness that destroys empires. And have your centuries of emotional isolation made your empire stronger or more vulnerable? Marcus asked, the question cutting straight to the heart of whether royal solitude was strength or limitation. The silence that followed carried the weight of Queen Saralyn's processing implications she'd never allowed herself to consider. When she spoke again, her voice held wonder mixed with fear. Captain Sterling, you are suggesting that I consider something that goes against every principle of royal authority I've maintained for over 3 centuries. I'm suggesting that maybe those principles have cost you more than they've protected, Marcus replied, understanding that their conversation was approaching a moment that would determine both their personal future and the political relationship between their species. Queen Saralyn rose from the crystalline bench with movements that suggested someone preparing to make a decision that would reshape everything about her understanding of leadership and personal connection. Captain, she said, her voice carrying royal authority mixed with personal uncertainty, if I were to consider what you're suggesting. If I were to explore whether personal partnership could enhance rather than compromise political effectiveness, what would that look like between a human captain and a Zephyrian queen? Marcus felt his heart rate increase as he realized that Queen Saralyn was asking not just about diplomatic possibilities but about personal relationship that transcended species barriers and political complications. Your Majesty, he said, it would look like 2 people who respect each other's minds and admire each other's achievements choosing to discover whether they could build something together that strengthens both their peoples and their personal happiness. Queen Saralin's crystalline throne across the garden began pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that reflected emotional intensity she could no longer entirely control. "Captain Sterling," she said, "what you're describing sounds remarkably like what humans call love, applied to circumstances that have never been tested between people in our positions." "Yes, Your Majesty," Marcus said simply. "That's exactly what I'm describing." The admission hung between them like a bridge across the vast gulf between their species, their positions, and their carefully constructed emotional defenses, while Queen Saralyn processed whether she had the courage to cross it. The days following Marcus and Queen Saralyn's garden conversation created a tension throughout the palace that seemed to affect the very architecture. Crystal formations pulsed with unstable patterns, bioluminescent displays flickered erratically, and the building itself seemed to respond to the Queen's emotional turmoil in ways that made everyone uncomfortably aware that something significant was shifting in the royal chambers. Marcus found himself effectively isolated from official proceedings as Queen Saralyn surrounded herself with additional protocol and ceremony that made private conversation impossible, but her behavior during formal meetings carried new complexities that suggested his words had fundamentally altered her perspective on their relationship. Captain Sterling's strategic analysis regarding Void Syndicate containment demonstrates sophisticated understanding of multidimensional warfare, Queen Saralyn said during a formal military briefing, her voice carrying professional respect that hadn't been present in their earlier interactions. His recommendations merit serious consideration. The acknowledgement was politically significant, but Marcus noticed that Queen Saralyn still avoided direct eye contact when discussing his contributions, as if looking at him might reveal emotions she wasn't prepared to make public. Ambassador Chen approached Marcus after the briefing with the expression of someone whose political instincts were detecting changes he couldn't quite analyze. "Captain, Queen Saralyn's attitude toward our delegation has shifted considerably. Her hostility has been replaced by something that looks almost like careful consideration. Perhaps our proposals have merit she didn't initially recognize," Marcus replied diplomatically, though he understood that the shift reflected personal rather than political evolution. The crisis that forced them into genuine collaboration came when long-range scanners detected massive Void Syndicate fleet movements toward the Zephyrian border worlds, creating a military emergency that required immediate strategic coordination between human and Zephyrian forces. "Captain Sterling," Queen Saralyn announced during the emergency strategy session, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose personal feelings had been overridden by military necessity, "your experience with Void Syndicate tactical patterns makes your input essential for developing effective defense protocols." The strategy sessions that followed extended through multiple days and nights as they worked to coordinate defenses that could protect both human and Zephyrian territories from the approaching threat. Away from formal diplomatic protocols and surrounded by tactical displays and strategic analysis, Marcus and Queen Saralyn fell into the kind of intellectual partnership that transcended political boundaries. The Syndicate's approach pattern suggests they're planning simultaneous strikes against multiple strategic targets, Queen Saralyn observed, manipulating holographic displays with the fluid precision of someone whose mind processed tactical information faster than most people could read. "Agreed," Marcus said, studying the enemy movement patterns while appreciating the way Queen Saralyn's strategic thinking operated on levels that challenged his own analytical capabilities. "But their coordination requirements create vulnerable communication windows we could exploit with properly timed counterstrikes." Their collaboration evolved from necessity into genuine intellectual partnership as they developed defense strategies that utilized both human adaptability and Zephyrian tactical precision. Working together on problems that could determine the survival of both their civilizations, they began to understand how their different approaches to leadership and strategy could complement rather than conflict with each other. "Marcus," Queen Saralyn said during one of their late-night planning sessions, using his first name for the first time since they'd met, "your ability to find innovative solutions to impossible tactical problems is remarkable. Your Majesty's strategic vision operates on scales I'm still learning to comprehend," Marcus replied, noting that her use of his first name suggested a shift toward personal rather than purely professional interaction. "Saralyn," she said quietly, offering her name like a gift that carried implications beyond simple informality. When we're working together on strategies that could save both our peoples, royal titles seem less important than tactical efficiency. The intimacy created by shared crisis and intellectual partnership gradually broke down the emotional barriers that Queen Saralyn had maintained for centuries, until the moment when Marcus's analysis of enemy strategic patterns led him to a conclusion that made his blood run cold. "Saralyn," he said, "the Syndicate isn't just planning military conquest. Their approach patterns suggest they're preparing to harvest Zephyrian crystal consciousness technology for integration into their collective systems." Queen Saralyn's face went pale as she processed the implications, not just military defeat, but the destruction of everything that made Zephyrian civilization unique. "They want to steal the consciousness technology that connects our people to our crystal matrices," she said, her voice tight with horror at the thought of her people's minds being harvested for enemy use. "And if they succeed, Zephyrian civilization doesn't just lose territory, it loses its essential identity," Marcus confirmed, understanding why this threat went beyond conventional warfare into existential crisis. The weight of what they were facing, the potential destruction of everything Queen Saralyn had spent centuries protecting, created emotional intensity that finally shattered her carefully maintained royal composure. "Marcus," she said, her voice breaking with emotion she could no longer contain, "if we fail, if my people lose not just their freedom but their fundamental consciousness, then everything I've sacrificed personal happiness to protect becomes meaningless." "We won't fail," Marcus said, moving closer until he was within reach of someone whose vulnerabilities had finally overwhelmed her royal armor. "Saralyn, we'll find a way to protect your people and preserve what makes Zephyrian civilization worth defending." "How can you be so certain?" she asked, tears making her ethereal features even more beautiful and utterly human despite her alien heritage. "Because I'm fighting for something more than strategic objectives now," Marcus said, his voice carrying conviction that made Queen Saralyn's breath catch. "I'm fighting for the woman I love and the people she's devoted her life to protecting." The confession hung between them as Queen Saralyn processed not just his admission of love but his claim of partnership in the deepest responsibilities of her reign. "Marcus," she whispered, "you realize what you're saying? You're claiming not just romantic interest but willingness to share the burden of protecting an entire civilization." "I'm claiming that I want to be yours, Saralyn," Marcus said, stepping closer until they were near enough that royal protocol became irrelevant compared to human connection. "Your partner, your ally, your support in carrying responsibilities that no one should bear alone." Queen Saralyn's response came not in words but in the way she collapsed the careful distance she'd maintained between them, allowing him to hold her while she processed emotions that 3 centuries of royal training hadn't prepared her to handle. "Just a man," she whispered against his shoulder, echoing her earlier dismissal with bitter irony. "Your man," Marcus whispered back, "if you'll have me." The resolution of both their personal relationship and the Void Syndicate crisis came when Queen Saralyn made the most courageous decision of her centuries-long reign. Instead of hiding their partnership behind diplomatic protocols, she chose to present their collaboration as a strategic alliance that could strengthen both their peoples through genuine cooperation rather than formal treaties. "Marcus," she said during the final strategy session before the expected Syndicate assault, "what we've built together over these past weeks, this intellectual partnership, this personal connection, it's made both of us more effective leaders than we were apart." Marcus studied her face, seeing someone whose understanding of power and responsibility had evolved beyond the isolation that had defined her previous rule. "You're suggesting that our partnership could become a model for human Zephyrian cooperation?" "I'm suggesting that love doesn't have to weaken leadership," Saralyn replied, her voice carrying conviction that 3 centuries of suppressed feelings had crystallized into wisdom. "Our connection has made me a better strategist, a more complete leader, someone who fights not just from duty but from personal investment in protecting what matters." The battle against the Void Syndicate forces proved her right. Fighting together, with Marcus coordinating human fleet movements while Saralyn directed Zephyrian crystal tech defenses, they achieved tactical coordination that exceeded anything either species could have accomplished independently. Their personal partnership translated into military effectiveness that turned what should have been a devastating defeat into a decisive victory. The combined fleet movements were flawless, Admiral Torres reported after the Syndicate forces had been routed from both human and Zephyrian space. Captain Sterling's adaptive tactics meshed with Queen Saralyn's strategic coordination like they'd been planning together for decades. "We have been, in a way," Marcus said, watching Saralyn coordinate post-battle operations with the kind of confident authority that no longer needed to mask personal feelings. Just not in the way anyone expected. The political aftermath of their military success created opportunities that neither had anticipated. Instead of being viewed as a diplomatic complication, their partnership was hailed by both species as proof that genuine cooperation could achieve results that formal treaties alone couldn't produce. "Your Majesty," Ambassador Chen said during the follow-up negotiations that established permanent Human-Zephyrian alliance protocols, "the coordination you and Captain Sterling demonstrated during the crisis has created a template for interspecies cooperation that's being studied throughout the galaxy." "Ambassador Chen," Saralyn replied, her hand finding Marcus's in a gesture that would have been impossible before she learned to balance personal connection with public authority. "What Captain Sterling and I discovered is that authentic partnership enhances rather than compromises effective leadership." 6 months later, Marcus stood beside Saralyn in the Crystal Gardens where their relationship had truly begun, watching human and Zephyrian engineers work together on defense installations that utilized both species' technologies in ways that neither could have developed alone. "Any regrets about choosing partnership over isolation?" Marcus asked, enjoying the simple pleasure of being able to touch her freely now that their relationship had become not just accepted but celebrated as a model for interspecies cooperation. Saralyn considered the question while reviewing reports from the joint Human-Zephyrian research facilities that had grown out of their military alliance. "Just one regret." "What's that?" Marcus asked, though her smile suggested it wasn't serious. "I regret all the years I spent believing that being queen meant I couldn't also be someone's beloved," she said, her voice carrying contentment that centuries of royal duty had never provided. "It turns out that loving someone who sees you as both a capable leader and a woman worth cherishing makes you stronger in both roles. And being loved by someone who trusts you with the responsibility for entire civilizations makes you more committed to being worthy of that trust," Marcus replied, understanding that their partnership had transformed not just their personal lives but their effectiveness as leaders. Their kiss was witnessed by representatives from dozens of species who had come to study the political and military innovations emerging from their collaboration, but Saralyn no longer cared about maintaining the emotional distance that had defined her previous 3 centuries of rule. "Your man," she whispered against his lips, echoing the words that had changed everything between them. "Your man," Marcus confirmed, "and proud to serve both you and the people you've devoted your life to protecting." Around them, the crystal gardens bloomed with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the emotional harmony between two leaders who had discovered that love could be not a weakness to hide but a strength to build upon. The queen who had dismissed him as just a man had learned that the right man could make her reign more effective rather than more complicated, while proving that sometimes the most powerful diplomatic breakthroughs came not from treaties but from the courage to whisper dangerous truths that transformed everything. The woman who had spent centuries believing that authority required isolation now ruled an empire stronger than ever before, supported by someone who saw her crown not as a barrier to connection but as a responsibility worthy of sharing. And the man who had once been dismissed as insignificant had become the partner of the galaxy's most powerful queen, proving that sometimes the most important battles were won not through conquest but through the quiet courage to claim your place in someone's heart.